In the decades preceding the Second World War, Bessarabia occupied a complex position at the crossroads of Eastern Europe. The region, corresponding broadly to present-day Moldova and parts of southwestern Ukraine, had shifted between powers multiple times since the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Romanian forces entered Bessarabia in January 1918, and the local council, known as Sfatul Țării, voted for unification with Romania in March of the same year. The Soviet government in Moscow never accepted this annexation, regarding Bessarabia as territory unlawfully occupied. For Romania, however, the integration of Bessarabia was presented as the correction of a historical injustice, anchoring its control over the lands between the Prut and Dniester Rivers. Throughout the interwar period, this unresolved dispute cast a long shadow. Romanian administrations worked to consolidate authority, extending land reforms, promoting Romanian language education, and attempting to integrate diverse communities that included Romanians, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Bulgarians, and Gagauz. Yet, many inhabitants remained ambivalent or discontent, either due to ethnic, cultural, or political grievances. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union never ceased to claim the region. Moscow occasionally raised the issue in the diplomatic exchanges, maintaining a legal and political basis for future action. The balance of power in Eastern Europe shifted dramatically with the outbreak of the Second World War. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union concluded the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty accompanied by secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Under this agreement, Bessarabia was assigned to the Soviet sphere. While Romania had initially leaned toward neutrality, the fall of France in June 1940 and the rapid expansion of German influence left Bucharest isolated. Exploiting the situation, the Soviet government issued an ultimatum to Romania on 26 June 1940, demanding the immediate evacuation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Lacking external support and unable to resist militarily, Romania accepted the ultimatum and withdrew within 4 days. The Soviet occupation of Bessarabia introduced a new order. Administrative structures were reorganized, with the northern and southern districts incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR, while the central territory was merged with a portion of the Moldavian Autonomous SSR on the left bank of the Dniester to form the Moldavian SSR. Soviet authorities implemented sweeping changes, including collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industries, and political purges targeting former Romanian officials, landowners, clergy, and suspected opponents of Soviet rule. Tens of thousands were deported eastward in 1940-41, while others fled across the Prut into Romania. These upheavals left deep scars and influenced local responses to the next turn of events. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 radically altered the strategic environment once again. Romania, under Marshal Ion Antonescu, allied itself with Germany in hopes of regaining lost territories. Bessarabia, lying directly on the path of the Axis Southern Offensive, became both a political objective and a military battleground. The Romanian army mobilized more than 25,000 soldiers for the campaign, supported by German formations of Army Group South. Facing them was the Soviet 9th and 18th Armies, whose defensive lines stretched along the Prut and Dniester. The stage was set for a violent confrontation that would twice devastate the region within 3 years. Thus, by the summer of 1941, Bessarabia stood as a contested frontier. For Romania, the campaign promised the restoration of sovereignty over lands lost under duress. For the Soviet Union, it was the defense of its newly acquired territory and a vital part of its southwestern front. For the local population, it meant another round of uncertainty, as armies prepared to clash in a space where allegiance was often imposed by force and survival was the primary concern. On 22nd June 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, directed against the Soviet Union along a vast front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Within this grand strategy, Bessarabia occupied a critical southern sector. For Adolf Hitler, control of the region meant securing the flank of Army Group South and establishing a firm base for the advance into Ukraine. For Romania, the operation provided the opportunity to regain Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, territories lost the previous year. The campaign was presented in Bucharest as a war of national redemption, while in Moscow it was portrayed as a struggle for survival against aggression. Romanian participation was substantial. Marshal Ion Antonescu committed over 5,000 troops, organized into the 3rd and 4th Armies, with divisions composed of infantry, cavalry, and supporting artillery. German elements included the 11th Army, under General Eugen Ritter von Schobert, equipped with armored and mechanized formations, though fewer in number compared to the central and northern sectors of the invasion. Facing them were the Soviet 9th Army commanded by General Yakov, Cherevichenko, and the 18th Army under General Andrei Smirnov, totaling around 18,000 to 2,000 men in the Bessarabian sector. Their defenses relied on the Prut River line, reinforced by field fortifications, but insufficiently prepared for sustained combat. Initial movements began in late June, as German and Romanian forces crossed the Prut. Romanian units, supported by German artillery and air cover from the Luftwaffe, launched probing attacks to test Soviet defenses. Resistance varied. In some sectors, Red Army units withdrew after light clashes, while in others they mounted determined stands. The terrain, rivers, rolling hills, and fertile farmland both aided defenders and complicated the attackers' logistics. The Soviet command, already overwhelmed by the shock of the German offensive across the entire front, struggled to coordinate reserves. Communications breakdowns and rapid Axis advances elsewhere left the southwestern front increasingly vulnerable. Civilians found themselves caught in the opening storm. Villages along the Prut were evacuated or destroyed in the fighting, while local communities faced dilemmas of survival. Some residents, recalling Soviet deportations of 1940, welcomed the Romanian return, while others, particularly those integrated into new Soviet structures, feared reprisals. For most, however, allegiance was secondary to the immediate threats of bombardment, requisitions, and displacement. Refugee flows moved in both directions, westward into Romania to escape Soviet conscription, and eastward deeper into Soviet territory to avoid Axis occupation. At the command level, Antonescu coordinated closely with the German 11th Army, but tensions soon emerged. Romanian officers sought to demonstrate national capability, pushing their own formations into the forefront of the fighting, while German leaders doubted their allies' efficiency. Early reports of high Romanian casualties and frontal assaults against entrenched Soviet positions reinforced German skepticism. Yet the political necessity of involving Romanian forces in the liberation of Bessarabia kept them deeply engaged in the campaign. By early July 1941, the first phase of the battle for Bessarabia was fully underway. Axis forces had secured several bridgeheads across the Prut, opening the path toward Chișinău and the Dniester. Soviet commanders faced a decision: attempt to hold the river line at all costs or fall back to preserve their armies for defense in depth. The choices made in these opening weeks would determine not only the fate of the region, but also the broader trajectory of the Southern Front in the early months of the war. The strategic goals of both sides in the Bessarabian campaign reflected broader calculations within the context of the Eastern Front. For Germany, Bessarabia was only a component of Army Group South's mission, which aimed to seize Ukraine's agricultural heartland, industrial centers, and access to the Black Sea. The region itself was not rich in natural resources, but its geography mattered. Control of the Dniester line offered security for operations toward Odessa and further east into the southern Soviet Union. Moreover, it removed the threat of Soviet forces launching counterattacks across the Prut into Romania, which was a vital oil supplier for the German war effort. Securing Romanian oil from Ploiești remained one of Berlin's highest priorities, and keeping the southern flank stable was essential. For Romania, however, Bessarabia carried deeper meaning. The recovery of the territory lost in 1940 was not only a military task, but also a political necessity. Antonescu's regime staked much of its legitimacy on reversing the humiliation of the Soviet ultimatum. Propaganda presented the campaign as a crusade of restoration, emphasizing the idea of liberating lands and people forcibly detached from the Romanian state. The Army's high command sought to balance symbolic objectives with operational demands, advancing quickly enough to demonstrate commitment to the Axis cause, yet also avoiding catastrophic losses that could undermine Romania's military capacity for future campaigns. The Soviet side entered the campaign at a disadvantage, but with clear priorities. For the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, Bessarabia formed part of the Southwestern Front, which was tasked with holding a line stretching from the Carpathians to the Black Sea. The key objective was to delay and exhaust the Axis advance, preventing a rapid breakthrough into Ukraine. Soviet forces received orders to fortify defensive positions along the Dniester, particularly around strategic cities such as Chișinău, Bălți, and Tiraspol. These areas were intended to serve as strong points in a layered defense. At the same time, Stavka aimed to preserve manpower and equipment for counteroffensives that might be launched once reserves from deeper in the Soviet Union were mobilized. Logistics played a decisive role in shaping strategies. For the Axis, the rapid crossing of the Prut created immediate supply difficulties. Roads were often poor, bridges destroyed in retreat by the Red Army, and the summer heat added strain to both men and horses. German divisions were better equipped with motor transport, but Romanian units relied heavily on animal-drawn carts, slowing their progress and complicating coordination. Ammunition and fuel shortages appeared regularly, limiting the pace of operations. Conversely, the Soviets benefited initially from shorter supply lines, since their depots had been established in the region during the year of occupation. Yet, as they retreated, these depots had to be abandoned or destroyed, gradually eroding their logistical advantage. Both sides made significant use of air power. The Luftwaffe, operating from Romanian bases, sought to neutralize Soviet airfields and support ground operations through bombing runs against troop concentrations and supply hubs. Romania's own air force contributed fighters and bombers, though with less advanced equipment and smaller numbers. The Soviet Air Force responded with mixed effectiveness. Some units fought bravely but suffered heavy losses on the ground during the initial days of the invasion. Control of the skies was crucial for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and disrupting enemy logistics, and the Axis gradually gained an edge in air superiority over Bessarabia. Intelligence estimates influenced command decisions. German and Romanian planners underestimated the ability of Soviet forces to regroup under pressure. Reports in early July suggested that Soviet resistance was collapsing, but in reality, Soviet units were preparing to withdraw in a controlled fashion toward the Dniester. On the Soviet side, intelligence about the scale of Axis commitment was often fragmented. While Stavka recognized the threat posed by German mechanized formations, they initially overestimated the strength of Romanian divisions, assuming them to be more motorized and heavily equipped than was actually the case. Propaganda efforts mirrored these military calculations. In Romania, newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts emphasized the liberation of brothers across the Prut, portraying the campaign as both a national duty and a moral mission. In the Soviet Union, state media described the Axis invasion as a fascist assault on peaceful citizens, calling for total resistance and framing the conflict in ideological terms. For civilians in Bessarabia, this competing messaging often contrasted with the daily reality of bombardments, requisitions, and uncertainty about which authority would prevail. By mid-July 1941, the plans and intentions of both sides had begun to collide with the realities of terrain, logistics, and resistance. The Axis sought a swift campaign to secure Bessarabia before shifting focus to Odessa and deeper into Ukraine. The Soviets aimed to trade space for time, slowing the enemy and preparing countermeasures. Both approaches carried risks, and as operations unfolded, commanders on the ground were forced to adapt quickly to the fluid and destructive nature of modern warfare in the region. The initial engagements in Bessarabia quickly escalated into a series of intense confrontations that tested both armies. By early July 1941, Romanian and German forces had secured multiple bridgeheads over the Prut, allowing them to push deeper into the contested region. The Soviet command responded by ordering counterattacks designed to halt or delay the Axis advance, but the imbalance in coordination and air support increasingly favored the attackers. The 9th and 18th Soviet armies attempted to stabilize their lines, yet faced mounting pressure from converging Axis offensives. One of the first major clashes occurred near Iași and along the lower Prut, where Romanian divisions supported by German artillery attempted to dislodge Soviet defenders. Romanian infantry often bore the brunt of these frontal assaults, advancing across open terrain under fire. Casualties were high, reflecting both the determination of Soviet resistance and the limited protective equipment and motorization available to Romanian forces. German observers noted both courage and inexperience among their allies, while Soviet reports emphasized the heavy cost inflicted on the advancing troops. As the fighting spread, Axis forces moved toward key urban centers. Chișinău, the largest city in Bessarabia, became a primary objective. Soviet units fortified positions around the approaches, laying mines and preparing defensive belts. However, the Axis advance was not solely a matter of battlefield maneuvers. The Luftwaffe launched repeated strikes on railway junctions, depots, and troop concentrations, crippling Soviet mobility. Romanian air units contributed, though with older aircraft and fewer sorties. Control of the skies allowed the Axis to disrupt Soviet reinforcements and sow confusion among retreating formations. Civilians bore the immediate consequences of these operations. Entire villages were caught between artillery duels and air raids. Some communities attempted to evacuate toward the Dniester with retreating Soviet columns, while others sought refuge in surrounding countryside. The rapid changes of authority generated uncertainty. Those who had adapted to Soviet rule during the past year faced the prospect of Romanian reoccupation, while others, particularly those persecuted in 1940, expected relief but feared new reprisals. The front lines did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Requisitions of food, forced labor, and mass displacements became part of daily life. Morale varied widely across the battlefield. Among Romanian troops, enthusiasm for recovering lost territory was tempered by the realization of the high cost of assaults against entrenched defenders. German officers remained focused on pressing forward, sometimes criticizing their allies but also acknowledging the political necessity of Romanian participation. Soviet morale was shaken by the scale of the German invasion across the entire front, but local units often fought with determination to buy time for evacuation and reorganization. Propaganda on both sides sought to sustain endurance. Romanian messages stressed national duty, while Soviet broadcasts demanded resistance against the invaders. Unexpected outcomes shaped the early phase of the campaign. Soviet attempts to launch counteroffensives were repeatedly broken up by Axis airstrikes and artillery coordination. Nevertheless, Soviet forces succeeded in slowing the advance more than Axis planners had anticipated. Each crossing of a river, or capture of a fortified position, consumed days and incurred significant losses. This delay allowed parts of the Soviet armies to withdraw in better order toward the Dniester, avoiding complete encirclement. By mid-July, the battles of engagement had defined the tempo of the campaign. Axis armies gained ground, but at the expense of men and resources, while Soviet defenders sacrificed territory in exchange for time and the preservation of forces. The shifting lines created a devastating impact on Bessarabian society with no stability in sight. The clash between Axis determination to reclaim and hold the region and Soviet resolve to defend and delay laid the foundation for an increasingly destructive struggle that would continue to unfold across the region's cities, rivers, and countryside. The escalation of the Bessarabian campaign in July 1941 brought the conflict to a new level of intensity. After initial crossings of the Prut, the Axis command directed both German and Romanian armies to expand their offensives, seeking to destroy Soviet formations before they could regroup along the Dniester. This shift required greater concentration of forces, heavier bombardments, and coordinated maneuvers across a broad front stretching from northern Bukovina to the Black Sea. The tempo of operations increased, but so did the human and material cost. Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies advanced along parallel axes, supported by elements of the German 11th Army. The plan envisioned converging thrusts towards central Bessarabia, cutting Soviet lines of communication and forcing withdrawals. However, the Soviets resisted fiercely. Units of the 9th and 18th Armies, reinforced by local reserves, attempted to mount counterattacks near Bălți and Chișinău. These engagements often turned into attritional battles, with Axis forces pushing forward under heavy fire, while Soviet troops fought delaying actions to cover retreats. The use of fortified villages, natural obstacles, and scorched earth tactics complicated Axis progress. The fighting conditions imposed severe strains on command structures. Romanian divisions, although numerically strong, suffered from shortages of heavy artillery and mechanized transport. Infantry often marched long distances in summer heat, arriving exhausted before entering combat. German officers grew frustrated at the slower pace of their allies, while Antonescu insisted on maintaining a visible Romanian role in every significant operation. Coordination problems occasionally led to gaps in the front, which Soviet commanders tried to exploit with limited local offensives. At the same time, German and Romanian staffs contended with extended supply lines, as destroyed bridges and poor roads hindered deliveries of fuel and ammunition. Terrain and weather amplified the crisis. Summer heat dried out water sources and spread disease, particularly dysentery, among troops. Dust clogged engines and reduced visibility, while lack of clean water added to logistical problems. Soldiers on both sides reported shortages of rations, with Axis forces relying heavily on local requisitions and Soviet troops depending on supplies that were increasingly disrupted by airstrikes. Civilians thus endured double pressures: bombardment from battles and confiscation of food by whichever army controlled their village at the moment. Internationally, the escalation in Bessarabia attracted limited attention compared to the massive battles around Smolensk and Kiev, but it had regional consequences. Bulgaria, though not yet engaged directly in the Soviet war, observed developments closely as Axis forces consolidated their positions on the Black Sea. Turkey, maintaining neutrality, watched the changing balance with concern, aware that the fate of Bessarabia could influence security in the Black Sea basin. Germany encouraged Romania to commit further, reassuring its ally of strategic importance while pressing for faster advances to secure the flank of Army Group South. Inside the Soviet Union, the growing crisis triggered debates within the command of the Southwestern Front. Should they attempt to hold Chișinău and Odessa with major forces, or conduct an organized retreat to the Dniester and beyond? Orders from Moscow were inconsistent, sometimes demanding stubborn defense, at other times allowing withdrawal. This uncertainty led to costly stand-and-fight actions in certain sectors, where units were overrun, while others retreated more successfully. Despite these difficulties, Soviet forces avoided total encirclement in Bessarabia, a partial achievement considering the overall disarray on other parts of the front. The civilian situation deteriorated rapidly. Bombings destroyed infrastructure, railways, and markets. Urban centers such as Chișinău faced shortages of electricity and water as utilities collapsed under strain. Refugee columns clogged roads, mingling with retreating Soviet units and complicating military maneuvers. Jewish communities in particular faced a worsening environment, targeted both by Soviet deportations in 1940 F-41 and by growing anti-Jewish measures under Romanian authority as Axis forces advanced. These overlapping hardships deepened the humanitarian crisis long before final battles for the region were fought. By the end of July 1941, escalation had transformed the Bessarabian campaign from limited engagements into a full-scale confrontation, consuming vast resources. The Axis advance continued, but at a slower pace than planned, while the Soviets preserved portions of their armies by retreating eastward. Political demands, logistical strains, and the human toll all intensified. The struggle for Bessarabia now entered its critical stage, where the costliest battles for cities and strongpoints would decide immediate control of the region. The peak of the Bessarabian campaign came in late July and early August 1941, when Axis forces pressed toward the Dniester and Soviet commanders attempted to preserve their armies from destruction. The battles for Chișinău, Bălți, and the approaches to Odessa marked the culmination of weeks of attrition. By this stage, both sides had committed substantial reinforcements, turning the region into one of the Southern Front's focal points. Chișinău became the centerpiece of operations. Romanian Fourth Army units, reinforced by German elements, closed in on the city from multiple directions. Soviet troops entrenched themselves in defensive belts around the outskirts, supported by artillery emplacements and anti-tank obstacles. The defense relied heavily on urban terrain, with factories, schools, and residential blocks converted into strongpoints. For the attackers, taking the city required systematic street fighting, a type of combat for which Romanian troops had limited prior experience. Casualties mounted quickly, and destruction spread through neighborhoods as artillery barrages preceded each advance. After days of intense struggle, Soviet forces withdrew eastward, evacuating what equipment they could and leaving behind ruins. The fall of Chișinău symbolized the Axis recovery of central Bessarabia, but it did not end the fighting. In the north, battles around Bălți further illustrated the cost of the campaign. The Soviet command reinforced the sector with units drawn from the 18th Army, attempting to maintain a line long enough to permit orderly retreat. Axis forces encountered well-prepared defenses along rivers and marshy terrain. German artillery and air power inflicted heavy damage, but the Romanian infantry carried the burden of advancing into hostile positions. Reports from the front described severe losses, with some battalions reduced by a third within a single engagement. The determination of Soviet troops in these delaying battles ensured that withdrawal routes to the east remained open. Southward, attention turned toward the Black Sea littoral. The capture of Bessarabia opened the route to Odessa, one of the Soviet Union's key ports. Even before Bessarabia was fully secured, German and Romanian commanders began preparing for the siege that would follow. Supply considerations loomed large. Odessa's fortifications and its access to sea-based resupply meant that seizing the city would demand a prolonged operation. Thus, the culmination of the Bessarabian campaign was not simply about territory, but about positioning forces for the next strategic objective. Civilian suffering peaked during this phase. Urban populations endured bombardments, shortages of food, and breakdowns in public services. Thousands were displaced as Soviet forces evacuated workers and specialists eastward, sometimes forcibly. Romanian authorities re-entered towns to find infrastructure damaged and local populations divided in sentiment. The Jewish population, already subjected to deportations under Soviet rule, now faced new threats as Axis occupation policies began to take shape. Mass arrests and violence marked the transition, signaling that military victory brought little relief to civilians caught between regimes. From the Axis perspective, the campaign's culmination delivered political dividends, but also revealed limitations. Romania regained control over territories lost in 1940, a powerful symbol for Antonescu's regime. Yet the cost was significant. Tens of thousands of casualties strained morale and exposed deficiencies in training, equipment, and logistics. German commanders noted the determination of their ally, but remained cautious about relying too heavily on Romanian divisions for future offensive operations beyond the Dniester. For the Soviets, the retreat across the Dniester marked a defeat, but not a collapse. Substantial elements of their forces escaped destruction, regrouping for the defense of Odessa and later campaigns in southern Ukraine. By August 1941, the campaign for Bessarabia had reached its peak. The Axis controlled the region, but at high cost, and the war continued to expand eastward. For the local population, the shift in authority brought another round of upheavals, new administrations, and new uncertainties. The battle for Bessarabias demonstrated both the ferocity of the Eastern Front and the tragic consequences of a territory repeatedly contested by rival powers. After the Axis capture of Bessarabia in August 1941, the region entered a new phase of occupation and resistance that would last until 1944. Romanian authorities quickly moved to reassert control, restoring pre-1940 administrative structures while also introducing new measures shaped by wartime realities and Axis alliance commitments. At the same time, Soviet forces that had retreated across the Dniester began reorganizing for countermeasures, while underground networks and partisan groups sought to disrupt Axis rule. The interplay between occupation policies, local adaptation, and Soviet resistance defined the character of Bessarabia during these years. Romania incorporated the reclaimed territory directly, rather than treating it as a temporary military zone. Civil administrations were reinstated, schools reopened under Romanian curricula, and state institutions sought to erase the imprint of Soviet authority. Yet the circumstances of war brought harsher realities. Food, livestock, and labor were requisitioned to support the Axis military presence, creating shortages and resentment among the local population. Transportation infrastructure was directed towards sustaining operations on the Eastern Front, leaving civilian needs secondary. For many communities, the presence of Romanian gendarmes and German advisors symbolized not liberation, but another form of coercion. Resistance took different forms. Some inhabitants joined partisan detachments organized by the Soviet NKVD, which carried out sabotage, assassinations, and intelligence gathering behind Axis lines. These groups operated in forests and remote areas, often supported by clandestine networks of sympathizers and villages. Their activity was limited compared to larger partisan movements further north in Belarus, but still represented a persistent security challenge. Axis forces responded with counterinsurgency campaigns, sweeping rural districts and carrying out reprisals against suspected collaborators. This cycle of attack and reprisal deepened divisions within local society and intensified civilian suffering. Adaptation was the more common response for ordinary people. Families sought ways to survive amid shifting demands. Farmers delivered quotas of grain or livestock to Romanian authorities, while also hiding part of their produce to sustain themselves. Others tried to navigate the complexities of dual identities, presenting loyalty to whichever authority held sway at the moment. Ethnic minorities faced distinct challenges. Ukrainians and Russians were often suspected of pro-Soviet sympathies, while Jews were subjected to systematic persecution under Romanian anti-Jewish policies. The deportations of Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina into Transnistria, beginning in late 1941, marked one of the darkest chapters of the occupation period, with tens of thousands dying from starvation, disease, or execution. On the military front, Romania's forces, having regained Bessarabia, were soon drawn deeper into the Soviet Union. Antonescu committed large contingents to operations in Ukraine, including the siege of Odessa and later the advance toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. This meant that many divisions initially stationed in Bessarabia were redeployed, leaving rear area security duties to gendarmerie units and second-line formations. The drain on manpower weakened the administrative grip over the province, making partisan activity somewhat easier, but also leaving communities vulnerable to both Soviet infiltrations and Axis reprisals. Propaganda sought to maintain morale and legitimacy. Romanian publications stressed the narrative of historical justice restored, while German propaganda emphasized the unity of Axis nations against Bolshevism. Soviet broadcasts, transmitted by radio and disseminated through clandestine leaflets, called on the population to resist and promised eventual liberation. Each message attempted to claim the loyalty of a population primarily concerned with survival. In practice, allegiance remained fluid, shaped by immediate risks and the shifting tide of the war. By 1942-43, the situation began to change as the Axis war effort faltered. Defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk weakened German dominance, while Soviet forces rebuilt strength for renewed offensives. In Bessarabia, rumors of the Red Army's return spread, unsettling Romanian administrators and prompting harsher security measures. Partisan activity increased, though still on a smaller scale than in other occupied territories. Civilians lived in a state of suspended uncertainty, aware that front lines might one day shift again and that their fate could change overnight, as it had in 1940 and 1941. Thus, the period between the Axis conquest of Bessarabia and the Soviet counteroffensive of 1944 was one of resistance, adaptation, and survival. Romanian authorities consolidated their rule, but only through coercion and extraction. Soviet forces kept alive the prospect of return through underground operations and propaganda. For the local population, the years of occupation were marked not only by political and military struggle, but also by the daily challenge of enduring a war that made their land a battleground between two great powers. The turning point for Bessarabia came in 1944, when the strategic balance of the Eastern Front shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. Following the catastrophic Axis defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 and the loss of initiative at Kursk later that summer, German and Romanian forces in the south faced a steady series of Soviet offensives. By spring 1944, Soviet troops had crossed the Dniester and threatened to cut off Axis formations in southwestern Ukraine. Bessarabia, once again, became the arena where the outcome of a major campaign would be decided. In March-April 1944, the Red Army launched the First Jassy Kishinev Offensive, aiming to push Axis troops out of the region and open the road to Romania. Soviet forces of the Second and Third Ukrainian fronts, numbering around 6,000 men, advanced against German and Romanian armies totaling approximately 4,000 Außenseelhors. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, the Soviet offensive stalled after initial gains. German General Johannes Friesner, commanding Army Group South Ukraine, and Marshal Ion Antonescu coordinated a stubborn defense along the fortified lines near Iași and Chișinău. The terrain of rivers, hills, and defensive belts slowed the Red Army's progress, while German panzer divisions conducted counterattacks to restore breaches. Soviet commanders underestimated the resilience of the defenders and faced logistical constraints that forced them to pause operations. For the local population, the temporary stabilization of the front meant another cycle of evacuations, bombardments, and requisitions as villages changed hands or lay within artillery range. The failure of the First Soviet offensive did not alter the broader strategic trajectory. By summer 1944, the Wehrmacht was in retreat on all fronts, and Germany's allies were wavering. Romania remained critical, both as an oil supplier and as a bulwark on the southern flank. Hitler insisted that Bessarabia and northern Romania be held at all costs, issuing directives forbidding withdrawal. Antonescu complied, recognizing the political risk of abandoning territory, but also aware of the limits of Romanian endurance. Meanwhile, Soviet preparations for a decisive operation continued, with massive concentrations of artillery, tanks, and aircraft being assembled for a renewed assault. In August 1944, the Second Jassy Kishinev Offensive was launched with overwhelming force. On 20th August, after a devastating artillery barrage, Soviet forces broke through Romanian and German lines on both flanks of the front. The Second Ukrainian Front under Rodion Malinovsky and the Third Ukrainian Front under Fyodor Tolbukhin coordinated deep encirclement maneuvers, cutting off large Axis formations in the region of Chișinău and Tiraspol. Within days, Army Group South Ukraine collapsed. Approximately 100,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, including major elements of the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. The scale of the disaster was such that German military historians later compared it to Stalingrad in terms of losses. For the Soviet Union, the offensive marked the recovery of Bessarabia and the opening of the road into Romania and the Balkans. For Romania, it precipitated a political crisis. On 23 August 1944, King Michael IV led a coup against Antonescu, arresting the marshal and declaring Romania's withdrawal from the Axis. Within hours, Bucharest announced an armistice with the Allies, and Romanian forces received orders to cease resistance against the Soviets and turn their arms against German troops still on Romanian soil. This sudden reversal transformed former allies into enemies overnight and reshaped the dynamics of the front. Civilians in Bessarabia endured the chaos of rapid shifts once again. Many who had adjusted to Romanian rule during the previous 3 years now faced the return of Soviet authority. Families that had fled in 1941 considered evacuation once more, though few succeeded as Soviet forces advanced too quickly. For others, the return of the Red Army meant conscription, reprisals, or the reopening of unresolved grievances from the earlier occupation. Jewish survivors in Bessarabia experienced the end of Axis persecution, but returned to destroyed communities and uncertain futures. Entire villages bore scars of repeated occupations, their populations reduced by deportations, executions, and flight. The turning point of 1944 thus reshaped the fate of Bessarabia. Militarily, the collapse of Axis defenses opened the Balkans to Soviet advance, contributing to the rapid withdrawal of Germany's allies from the war. Politically, Romania's defection accelerated the disintegration of the Axis alliance. For the people of Bessarabia, however, the second shift of the front within 4 years meant that devastation continued, even as the balance of power finally tilted decisively toward the Soviet Union. By the end of August 1944, combat operations in Bessarabia had drawn to a close, but the consequences of the campaign continued to unfold in immediate and often devastating ways. The Second Jassy Kishinev Offensive had not only shattered Axis defenses, but also transformed the political landscape of Eastern Europe. For soldiers and civilians alike, the days following the collapse of Army Group South Ukraine were marked by retreat, surrender, occupation, and the onset of new hardships. The German retreat was chaotic. Encircled formations attempted breakout maneuvers, often abandoning heavy equipment in order to move more quickly. Panzer divisions, short on fuel and surrounded, destroyed their own vehicles to prevent capture. Thousands of troops attempted to reach the Carpathian passes, but Soviet encirclement lines closed rapidly. Prisoner columns stretched for miles, with captured German and Romanian soldiers marched eastward under guard. Conditions in transit were harsh, with minimal food or water, and many succumbed before reaching prisoner-of-war camps. For the Romanian army, the shift from ally to adversary of Germany created immense confusion. Units that only days earlier had fought alongside German formations now received orders to disarm them. In some cases, clashes erupted between former comrades in arms, particularly where German commanders refused to recognize the Romanian armistice. Other formations surrendered en masse to Soviet troops, hoping for more lenient treatment after Romania's political realignment. Still, losses were immense. Out of roughly 400,000 Romanian soldiers committed to the front, tens of thousands were killed or captured during the summer campaign. Civilians in Bessarabia experienced another abrupt transition of authority. Soviet administrators returned, re-establishing control over institutions dismantled in 1941. The NKVD and Red Army security units immediately began screening the population for collaborators with Axis forces. Romanian officials, landowners, and others associated with the occupation were arrested, deported, or executed. Families faced sudden upheaval, with men drafted into the Red Army or forced labor units, while women and children attempted to rebuild homes damaged by bombardment. Agricultural production, already strained by years of requisitions and destruction, fell into crisis, leading to food shortages across rural districts. The Jewish population, decimated by deportations and massacres during Axis rule, faced the difficult task of survival in communities emptied of relatives and neighbors. Those who had endured camps in Transnistria or evaded deportation attempted to return, only to find homes occupied or destroyed. For other ethnic groups, the return of Soviet rule brought new uncertainties. Ukrainians, Russians, and Moldovans were drawn back into Soviet structures, while minorities such as Bulgarians and Gagauz once again navigated the demands of centralized policies imposed from Moscow. Strategically, the Soviet Union consolidated its hold on the region quickly. Bessarabia was reintegrated into the Moldavian SSR, with strict political oversight and preparations for economic collectivization. Military installations were established to secure the southwestern flank as the Red Army advanced deeper into the Balkans. Rail lines and roads were repaired under forced labor to ensure supply routes for continuing offensives toward Hungary and Yugoslavia. The region became both a rear area for Soviet operations and a staging ground for further advances. For Romania, the aftermath of the campaign marked both liberation and subjugation. The removal of German forces and the end of Antonescu's dictatorship offered hope of peace, but the Soviet presence limited Romania's sovereignty. The country was compelled to support Soviet war efforts and cede control over its foreign and military policy. The political transformation initiated by King Michael's coup would soon give way to deeper Soviet influence that reshaped Romania's post-war trajectory. In Bessarabia itself, the immediate aftermath of the 1944 campaign was defined by devastation. Towns such as Chișinău, already scarred from battles in 1941, now lay in ruins once again. Bridges, factories, and rail junctions were destroyed or dismantled. Fields stood neglected, and livestock had been driven off or slaughtered. For civilians, the end of frontline combat did not mean an end to suffering, but rather the beginning of reconstruction under a regime determined to impose lasting control. The retreat, surrender, and reoccupation of 1944 closed one chapter of warfare, but opened another era of profound political and social transformation. The legacy of the battles for Bessarabia during the Second World War is measured not only in shifting front lines, but also in the enduring consequences they produced for the region and its people. Between 1940 and 1944, authority over the territory changed hands 3 times: Romanian, Soviet, Romanian again, and finally Soviet once more. Each transition was accompanied by upheaval, violence, and the imposition of new political orders. The result was a profound dislocation of society, the effects of which extended well beyond the war itself. Militarily, the campaigns in Bessarabia highlighted the difficulties of sustaining operations in a region of limited infrastructure but high strategic value. For Germany, the territory offered a necessary flank guard for Army Group South, but defending it against Soviet offensives consumed resources that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. For Romania, Bessarabia represented both a symbol of national unity and a drain on manpower. Tens of thousands of Romanian soldiers were killed or wounded in battles to regain and then hold the province. The campaign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Romania's armed forces, its willingness to commit large numbers of troops, but also its vulnerability in terms of equipment, training, and reliance on German support. For the Soviet Union, the recapture of Bessarabia demonstrated the Red Army's growing operational maturity by 1944, capable of executing large-scale encirclements that destroyed enemy armies outright. Politically, the fate of Bessarabia shaped the trajectory of both Romania and the Soviet Union. For Antonescu's regime, the recovery of the territory in 1941 was a rallying point that justified alliance with Germany, but the eventual loss in 1944 undermined his authority and contributed directly to his downfall. For the Soviet Union, the reintegration of Bessarabia into the Moldavian SSR in 1944 consolidated territorial gains from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, ensuring control over the Dniester frontier. This formed part of Moscow's broader strategy to secure influence in Eastern Europe and establish a buffer zone against future threats. The region's incorporation into the Soviet system would last until the end of the USSR, shaping its political, cultural, and economic development for decades. The civilian consequences were immense. Deportations, massacres, forced labor, and requisitions during alternating occupations decimated communities. Jewish populations in particular suffered catastrophic losses under Axis rule, with deportations to Transnistria and mass killings, reducing centuries-old communities to fragments. Other groups experienced repeated displacements and persecution, depending on the regime in power. After 1944, Soviet policies of collectivization, Russification, and political repression further transformed social structures, creating a legacy of trauma and adaptation that continued long after the war ended. Economically, Bessarabia was left devastated. Agricultural production had collapsed under the strain of repeated requisitions and battlefield destruction. Towns and infrastructure required rebuilding from the ground up. Soviet authorities introduced new economic plans centered on collective farms and industrial development, reshaping patterns of labor and land ownership. Yet recovery was slow, and for many families, the memory of wartime losses remained inseparable from the hardships of post-war reconstruction. Culturally and historically, the battles for Bessarabia became contested symbols. In Romania, the campaign of 1941 was remembered as a moment of national sacrifice and recovery, though later overshadowed by the costs of alliance with Nazi Germany. In Soviet narratives, the 1944 liberation of Bessarabia was framed as part of the heroic advance of the Red Army, omitting or downplaying the earlier deportations and repressions of 1940–41. In Moldova, which inherited the legacy of the Moldavian SSR, memories of the wartime period remain deeply divided, reflecting the complex experiences of communities caught between larger powers. The historical significance of Bessarabia's wartime experience lies in its demonstration of how borderlands can become focal points of great power struggle, with local populations enduring the consequences of decisions made far beyond their control. The shifting battles of 1941 and 1944 illustrated the volatility of alliances, the brutality of modern total war, and the vulnerability of civilian life in contested regions. The legacy of these years remains visible today, not only in the demographic and cultural scars left by deportations and killings, but also in the contested narratives of history that continue to shape regional identity. In the broader context of the Second World War, Bessarabia was not the site of the largest battles or the highest casualties, but it was emblematic of the war's character in Eastern Europe, a struggle of empires fought over contested lands, where victory for one side almost always meant devastation for the people who lived there. Its history between 1940 and 1944 remains a reminder of the human cost of shifting front lines and the long shadows cast by war,